My name is Dan Finucane, and I'm currently a regent. I love folk music, blues music, and I love singing and playing with other people.
My name is Ian Peoples. I'm a Jesuit regent. I'm kind of a football fanatic. Most of my weekends are spent watching at least a few games. I'm probably one of the biggest Lionel Messi fans.
Welcome back to MagisTalk, where we ask the question, where is God calling me to today? My name is Dan Finucane, and I'm your host, joined by my brother and friend, Ian Peoples, and our special guest.
This episode marks the fourth installment of our Meet the Jesuits series. Today we're sitting down with a Jesuit whom many of you will have already met from his decade in Belize, Father Brian Christopher. Father Brian Christopher is currently serving as the superior of the Jesuit community here in Belize, a role he's had for a couple of years now, and the community is still standing, so thank you. Prior to being superior, he was the pastor of St. Martin de Porres Parish in Belize City. In the past, Father Brian has done work in conflict transformation with gang-involved youth and young adults in Belize City. Aside from his time in Belize, Father Brian has spent time doing pastoral work in San Antonio, and served as a high school teacher in St. Louis, Missouri. And I should say that's San Antonio, Texas, not Toledo District. And we are thrilled to have you on the show, Brian, so thank you. And,
nice to be here with you.
And you've seen
and
every
see
episode.
How you spend your afternoons. I've seen every episode at least 3 times now.
Wow. That's wonderful.
First question.
How do you view our show? Do you watch it online? Do you catch it on the radio?
When I close my eyes to pray, I try to imagine the most beautiful revelation possible. I try to imagine the beatific vision, and there your show just sort of appears to me.
I think our viewers would probably agree with that. Yeah,
and sometimes online too.
YouTube, Facebook.
Quite an endorsement, thank you.
Well,
are we done yet? I'm getting uncomfortable.
Father Jeremy said he was our biggest fan, but actually I think Brian might be our biggest fan. That's great. Yeah.
Well, you tell Jer.
Well, Brian, again, thank you for having us, and I think you and Dan share something in common.
We do. We share many things in common.
Besides the vocation.
Besides from both being Jesuits. We're both from the beautiful, wonderful city of St. Louis.
From the west end of the city. We grew up blocks, walking distance, although I might have been just a few years before him.
And actually, when I was in high school, speaking of a few years, this guy was a teacher. He never had me as a student. I never had him as a teacher. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about growing up in St. Louis, what that was like for you.
The good old days. Well, okay, we went to the same high school too. We went to a Jesuit high school in St. Louis University High School. And for me, that's where I started hearing a call to be a Jesuit. That's kind of where it happened for me. I'm not sure where you started experiencing that. And then I also went to St. Louis University, which you graduated from as well.
Man, you guys basically walked the same path.
I know he's kind of followed me. It's sort of like I'm sort of setting and he's sort of like, how can I be more like Brian?
Well, what was it about the Jesuits at SLU that made you want to?
Yeah, so I had never thought about being a priest before, and didn't grow up wanting to be a priest. It was when I was in high school. We had a Jesuit scholastic, kind of like we had Jesuit regents, kind of like what you're doing. We had a Jesuit regent who started a community outreach program, a community service program at SLU High. And we were he was taking groups of students up to North St. Louis. North St. Louis is a part of the city that is, you call it more inner city, very African-American, very low income. And we were going up there to the Jesuit parish on the north side, St. Matthew's Parish, and we were tutoring after school with kids from the neighborhood. And this Jesuit, and we had a great time doing that, but this Jesuit would always ask us really annoying questions. So when we were driving home from from volunteering, he would say, well, I want you to count up how many liquor billboards you see on the way home. He'd say, I want you to count up how many burnt out buildings you see on the way back. And we'd count it up, and he'd say, okay, well, how many did you see? Whatever, 5. He'd say, well, how many do you have in your neighborhood? And I'd say, well, none. There were no liquor billboards in my neighborhood. There were no liquor stores in my neighborhood. There were no burnt out buildings in my neighborhood. Everything in my neighborhood was nice and clean and orderly and all the rest. He'd say, well, why is that? I had no idea. I had no idea why that was. I had no idea why some people grow up in poverty and other people like me grow up never wondering where the next meal was going to come from. Had never thought about that. I just assumed that's the way it is. It's just the way it is. And then he would say, what does God think about that? And that question always blew me away because I never knew how to answer the question. But I think in hindsight, I recognized a couple of things that started to emerge in me just as a result of wrestling with that question. Number one, the thought that God would care at all, that God would have any thoughts at all about how we live or how we organize our cities, how we do education, that God has any thoughts at all about public policy. I never imagined that. I mean, I figured God cared about, am I going to church on Sundays? Yes. Do I say my prayers before bed? Most of the time. Do I say prayers before meal? Yeah. Okay, good. You're fine. But the idea that God really does care how we live our lives was a new thought to me, that God wanted to be that involved in our lives. The second thought that came to me was, I don't know that God likes how we treat each other. I think the fact that there are people like me who grow up never knowing hunger. I never doubted that I was going to go to college. Education was just a given. I had everything that I needed, maybe not everything I wanted, but I had everything that I needed. And yet there were these kids that I was working with every day after school, tutoring, and they would go an entire day without a meal. For them, having a bag of potato chips after school, that was going to be their dinner. And maybe God's not okay with that. That was the second thing. And then the third thing that I began to feel, and this emerged over the course of about a year, just this sense that God is not okay with the way we do things. God is not okay with the fact that some people live in poverty, and that God is trying to do something about that. And I started to feel like I was being invited to be a part of that. And sitting with that for a while, it didn't take too long before I started thinking, oh my gosh, maybe I want to be a Jesuit. Because the Jesuits were the ones that I knew who were asking these questions. And the other priests that I grew up knowing, I never heard these questions at church. So yeah, for me, my vocation really was to be a Jesuit. From I guess it was 17 when that popped into my head.
And you're Italian, from an Italian family, correct?
Yeah.
And so, do you have any priests or religious in your family?
No. My mom had 4 aunts who I never knew. They died long before I came around, who were nuns, and she had an uncle who was a priest, but I never knew any of them.
So what was that like? As you got older and approaching, thinking about entering the society, kind of sharing that with your family. Were they surprised, or what was that like? No, I
don't think they were surprised at all. I don't know if I was hoping they would be or what, but I don't think. I remember when I started kind of looking at the Jesuits, I would do these, we call them come and see weekends. They're like, you take a weekend and you go stay in a Jesuit community and just kind of get to know the life and kind of say, well, is this for me or not? And I remember telling one of my older brothers, I remember saying, yeah, I'm going to do this thing. And he said, I could totally see that. He said, if anybody in our family is going to be a priest, it was probably going to be you. Again, I'm not sure what that means, but there it is. But I'd like to believe, I don't know, maybe my family saw something in me that, hopefully they saw me as a man of service and a man of deep faith and prayer.
That's what I see you as, Brian, so.
Hence why I followed in your footsteps.
Yes.
That's right.
Keep talking.
Exactly. Well, what ultimately led you to enter the society then? Was there a moment where you kind of said, you know what, yes, this is definitely it? Or was it just kind of a growing sense of yeah, I want to be the one that asks those questions. I want to be the one that invites other people to ask those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I think it's what you just said. It was the second part of your answer. There was no moment where it was like, okay, I'm going to just do this and all on board. There was always this sense of doubt and wrestling. So I from the time I was 17 to the time I was 22, I did a lot of running away from this call, and I decided to go to college first. I knew I wanted to go to college and study and kind of do that thing. I actually did study a little bit.
And what did you study?
I studied philosophy and Russian. So it was either graduate school or working at McDonald's or being a Jesuit.
Did you study philosophy in Russian, though?
No.
Okay,
no,
that would have been interesting.
No.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of wrestling, and I think even after I entered, and even to some extent, I think the first time I really said, yes, I'm going to do this was when I took vows. And even after that, even when I was a scholastic, there was a lot of, I'm not sure. I mean, I think St. Ignatius was pretty smart when he put together our formation program. The Jesuit formation program is long. For me, it was 12 years. And it's good because you're getting tested. You're testing yourself. You're testing your vocation all along the way. And there are always going to be doubts that come up. And you're always going to wonder, is this for me? Do I want to go get married and have a family? Do I want to pursue another career? That's all there, and you have the time in Jesuit formation to wrestle with those questions, and that certainly came up for me. So it really was, I'd say for myself, I was a Jesuit for 10 years before I think deep in my heart I said, okay, yeah, I think God's calling me to this.
Yeah, and ultimately, I mean, that's what I love about our formation too. I think sometimes the length of it can seem overwhelming. It can feel that way if you start picturing the whole, decade plus. But I think the freedom that amount of time cultivates in us to really come to a deep sense of embracing the vocation, right? And to have so many different experiences to be able to prepare for that, right? Because, if you look at a diocesan priest or even other religious formation, it's philosophy, theology, ordination, right?
Right.
And the fact that we get to take time to, Dan and I as regents coming to Belize and working, for a few years. And then what was your regency like? Where were you at?
I taught for 2 years at St. Louis U High, where Dan and I went to school. And some of the students there were I didn't have such a great experience with some of the students there. So I taught there for 2 years, and then I did community organizing for 2 years in North St. Louis. So I had an extended regency. But you're right. I mean, you go through this time, and so by the time you get ordained, you've gone through a lot of crises in your life, and you've had a lot of joys in your life, and you've learned how to pray, and you've really learned who God is for you. And so by the time you get ordained, I think there's a certain wisdom there. I hope you're like gold tested in the fire, and that's the hope of formation.
And I think there's something to, the sense that, on the one hand, the crisis isn't fun to go through. But there is a sense in which part of discernment is really sitting with different options. Even after having made one, and seeking confirmation doesn't mean that every day is great, but that, considering having a family, being married is a good thing. And so you're not giving up, we're not saying yes to this life and saying no to something bad or something that's unpleasant, even though there are unpleasant parts about that life too. So I think really sitting with it, there's something very real about that, and that does lead to freedom. That does lead to saying yes over time, and then that yes kind of developing a root structure where it burrows down deep into your soul.
It's a beautiful metaphor. But you're right. I'm playing it, but you're absolutely right, though. You're absolutely right. No matter what your vocation is, there are going to be ups and downs. You're going to have good days and bad days. And for all of us, whether you're married or whether you're single or whether you're a Jesuit, the challenge is, can I surrender myself to God and open my heart up to receive whatever strength I need to face whatever challenges are in front of me, to keep growing as a warmly, lovingly human person, right? That's the goal. And that's going to be the same whether I choose to be a Jesuit or if I leave and get married, or that's always the challenge, The struggle's the same.
And you have now spent, as Ian mentioned at the beginning, about a decade here in Belize, but not all at the same time.
Right, 2 different stints.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit what led you here in the first place, and then what has brought you back.
So I was here in 1999 as a novice, and really, I was here for 6 months, and I really loved my time. I worked in Maskell Village and Key Caulker, and I taught in the primary schools in both places and did sacramental prep, and would spend 1 week at Key Caulker and the other week at Maskell, and just kind of went back and forth. I loved my time in Belize when I was here, and there's a saying here in Belize, I'm sure you've heard it, that once you drink the water, you always want to come back, and I feel like there's some truth to that. I drank the water, so to speak. So when I was coming through theology studies at the end of my formation, I was about a year before I got ordained. I was ordained in 2009, and if your viewers recall, in 2007, I think I'm sure they all remember, that's when there was a parade. I think there was the Independence Day festivities, the September celebrations, and somebody on Mayflower Street threw a hand grenade, and it exploded. And there were street gangs in Belize before that, but that was kind of like as a North American, I might call it the 9/11 moment, right? Where everybody said, we've got a really big problem. And then after that, there was a television show, I think by a British producer, about the gangs in Belize, and made everything look very dire. And so there was a lot of concern about gang violence, and during my formation, most of my ministry was with gang-involved youth along the way. And so when I was coming towards ordination, my provincial said, hey, would you want to go to Belize? We would like you to go to Belize and try to understand a little bit about what's going on with gang violence. Try to understand what's happening on the streets, what's happening in society, who the players are there people who are doing something about this, and how could we as Jesuits somehow be a part of the solution, be part of a response. So that's kind of how I spent my first 5 years. And we started a nonprofit organization called the Center for Community Resource Development. And it didn't, it only lasted about 6 or 7 years, but the idea, I think, was a good one of trying to work with young men and young women who had dropped out of school, and create small businesses where they could come in and work. While they're working, they're getting the life skills training, they're in a safe place, they're in a supportive and challenging environment, and they're able to earn a little bit of a stipend through the work. And then at the end of their time with us, we would help them find jobs. And to some extent that worked, but there were some big challenges along the way.
Yeah, and then so after that first 5 years, you went back to San Antonio, Texas.
I did tertianship, which is a year of preparation for final vows in the Jesuits. I did that for a year in Oregon in the United States. And then I was assigned to San Antonio, Texas for 2 years. But the whole time, in the back of my head, there was always all these great memories of Belize, and there was always this warm spot in my heart for Belize, and I wanted to come back. I had friends here. There were families here. I missed St. Martin's. I loved being a part of that community. And as much as I loved my time in San Antonio, and as much as I loved the families there, I was very, very grateful for the opportunity to come back here. And it felt like coming back home.
And you mentioned that you have worked for years, even prior to being in Belize, with gang-involved youth. Can you say a little bit more about what led you to getting into that kind of work?
For me, it came out of doing the spiritual exercises when I was a novice. And one of the real graces of the retreat was identifying this desire in me, not just to walk with people who were kind of on the margins of society, but people who are on the margins of the margins, right? So there are people in our world, people who are sick and families that are hungry, and you just sort of naturally feel this empathy and this compassion and this desire to serve, and that's all good. But then you have other people, like street gangs, who you see them and I think maybe a lot of people feel anger towards them. Look at how they're destroying society. And yet when you get to know these guys, they're just human beings like me and you, you know? And when you read the Gospels, that's who Jesus hangs out with. You know, when Jesus is born and the shepherds come to visit him, we think of shepherds as, oh, they're so darling, little shepherds with their cute little sheep. No, the shepherds had a terrible reputation for being thieves and drunkards and, you know, all the rest. They were kind of like the gangsters of 2,000 years ago. And so imagine that when Christ was born, when God became a human being, the first outsiders to come and welcome him were these gangsters, were these outsiders, the people who were scorned. Not only were they poor, but they were demonized. And that's what we have going on here in Belize and in the United States and in a lot of places in the world. We've got these primarily young men, but also some young women who grow up in traumatizing environments. And I'm not saying that they're all victims, right? But let's recognize the complexity of what's going on. And they get labeled by society as gangsters, as criminals, as something less than human beings. And you know what? When you grow up in a way when everybody's labeling you as a threat, well, guess what happens? You start to live into that label. And that's been my experience, is that people live into the labels we give them. And for myself, I wanted to go and be with them and walk with them to let them know that I love them. Christ loves them. That when I look at them, I don't see gangster. I see human being who in many ways is not different, at least not in any fundamental ways than me. I struggle with anger probably more than most. And so I hear it.
Can you say a word? I imagine this work in conflict transformation has something to do with what you're doing with gang-involved youth as well. I don't know if people have heard of that term before. I know before you taught a class, Starter Novitiate, I hadn't heard of conflict transformation before. I'd heard of conflict resolution. So can you just say a quick word about what conflict transformation is and why you got into that kind of work? And I think that might point back to how you worked with gang-involved youth as well.
Yeah, so let me take the second part of that question. How did I get into that work? So when I was doing my Regency in St. Louis, I was doing some community organizing. And by nature, I'm a conflict avoidant person. When there's conflict around, I get really, really anxious. I don't like it. And yet I knew that sometimes conflict was important if you want to make change in society. Anytime you go to change anything, there are going to be people resisting that change, and so there's going to be conflict around it. So I decided that I was going to try my hand at community organizing. Because what do you do in community organizing? You get a group of people together and you try to tap into what are the things that are going on in your neighborhood or your community that get you upset and you want to do something about. So community organizing in some ways is about taking that anger inside, and rather than letting it do destructive things, you channel it in productive ways. So how can I take my anger, my passion, and do something good with it? Okay, so that was when I was in Regency, and that was a really important moment of learning that anger is not a bad thing, that actually anger is a really important thing. Think about Jesus when he goes in the temple and he starts turning over tables in the temple. He wasn't being a nice guy. Jesus was not a nice guy. We're not called as Christians to be nice men and women. We're called to be loving, but that's different. So then when I went to theology studies, I took a course. I found a course on negotiation and conflict transformation. So I took that course and it just blew my mind. So this was kind of the other end of it. How do you, when conflict arises, what can you do to channel it? How do you help people channel the conflict that they're in? So I don't know if that's clear, but conflict resolution. When we talk about conflict resolution, the assumption is that conflict is bad and we want to make it go away. That's why we call it conflict resolution or conflict management. But the fact is, sometimes what we need to do if we're going to create a more just and more loving world is not make conflict go away. Sometimes we have to bring conflict to the surface. And sometimes we have to provoke conflict. And we always try to do it with love in our hearts. But sometimes we need anger and we need conflict, right? Because otherwise the tendency is to ignore the bad things going on. And we can't do that. We can't let that happen. So conflict transformation is, yes, it's about conflict resolution and how to reduce conflict, but more importantly, I think it's about how do you take conflict and keep it from becoming toxic, and instead, how do you take conflict and move it in positive directions? That's what that whole area of study is about.
And it is striking. I mean, community organizing really is about what you said. There's already a conflict going on. It's just under the surface.
Right.
And so it's unearthing it, and it's organizing a group of people around that grievance or that conflict and saying, this is actually happening.
Yeah.
Let's address it, and we're going to bring this conflict to the surface with people in power who can do something about it.
Because so often, people who don't have access to money, or people who don't have access to persons in power, they feel powerless. And so when problems come up in their neighborhoods or in their communities or in their homes, they shut down because they don't know what to do. They don't have access to anything. And part of what we try to do in community organizing and in conflict transformation is help people to recognize the fact that they already have power, and that maybe one person can't make a change. You might have a problem in your neighborhood. Let's say there's a stop sign that got ripped down or whatever, and you're like, well, if I go to my local area rep, well, nothing's going to happen. He's just going to kind of forget about me. Yeah, okay, maybe. But if you and your 50 closest friends go to his office, guess what's going to happen? Well, you'll have a stop sign the next day. And so it goes. I think in democracies, the unfortunate trend right now in democracies is that it's the politicians who are in power, and the people serve them and their interests. Whereas in a healthy democracy, it really should be the other way. I think elected officials ought to be accountable to their constituents. Unfortunately, in a lot of places, that relationship is broken down. So I think something like community organizing, conflict transformation, these are important strategies.
And, kind of bringing it back to your work with gang-involved youth here in Belize, how did conflict transformation play a role then in working with these groups who the conflict isn't below the surface? It doesn't seem anyway. It's very much on the surface. It's out in the open, or maybe it seems to be. Maybe there's a real conflict underneath. I don't know. How does conflict transformation, in your experience, play a role then in working with gang-involved folks and rival gangs?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, my experience is fairly limited. There are so many great folks, as you all know, in Belize right now who are doing this work right on the front lines, right, of the conflict. But I think a lot of my work was not at the nonprofit. That was something distinct. But in those first few years, the first 5 years that I was here in Belize, I spent a fair bit of time at the prison and walking around Martin's neighborhood and really just getting to know people. And I think, part of it was, in a sense, transgressing boundaries, if that makes sense. So being a priest, people don't, this is a sad commentary maybe on the state of our church, but people don't expect Farah to be walking around the streets, right? People expect, well, the priest is going to be in the church saying his prayers. But when the priest gets out and starts walking around, people really like that. But at first, it kind of takes them off guard. And especially for a lot of the younger guys who were caught up in gangs and whatnot. Well, first of all, they all thought I was with the CIA because I look like a cop. So that was one thing that took them off guard. But just walking around and getting to know guys and letting them know that I'm human like they are, and being vulnerable, walking into their space, and feeling that welcome, and looking at them and seeing them as human beings. That's really fundamental in conflict transformation. Is how do we start to see each other as human beings, beyond the labels that we often stick to each other. White, North American, priest, okay, but I'm still a human. Creole, gang involved, poor, South Side. Okay, but you're a human being. You're a human being. We're more than these labels. That's the fundamental of conflict transformation right there.
And I think going kind of on a different note right now, but not an entirely different note. we've been undergoing a communal apostolic discernment to talk about what's going on in our community, right, in Belize, and to sort of look at what can the Jesuits do. And that's a process that we've been undergoing for the past 9 months. It's been sort of long, but it's also been really exciting because we've heard from so many different Belizeans, some of whom we've had on our show, and like Cisco Woods and Miriam and Juarez, and so I want to hear from you about just what is communal apostolic discernment, and what has that process been like for you as the sort of leader of this process? What's that been like for you engaging in this with all these different Belizeans and with the community here?
So communal apostolic discernment is about listening for the voice of Christ and asking the question, how is Christ calling to us to follow him more closely, right? So I presume we're all doing somewhat of a decent job on most days of following.
We're trying.
But how is he calling to us now? And not just to you and to me and to you, but to the entire Jesuit community, the 12 of us who live here in Belize. How is God calling to us now? The Jesuits have been here for 150 years, and in a large part, we've been doing the same thing for 150 years, which, hey, that's great. Running parishes, running schools, this is wonderful stuff. But Belize has changed. Belize has changed a lot since 1851. Belize has changed a lot even in the last 20 years, in the last 10 years. And so every so often we have to hit pause, and I think as a religious community we need to ask the question, how is Christ calling to us now? We have wonderful lay partners that we work with at Martin's and Peter Claver and SJC, and they're doing great work there. But for us, for vowed Jesuits, are we being called maybe to look in different directions? Are we being called to respond differently than we have been? And it's so easy to fall into a rut and say, well, this is what we've always done, and this is what we're always going to do. But I think the Holy Spirit she doesn't usually let people sort of settle into their ruts. She always has a way of giving us a good shake. And that's what this process is about. It's about looking around at Belize right now as it is in 2021, 2022, and saying, okay, what's going on here? What is this reality that we're living in? And how is Christ speaking to us? Now, in order to do that, as North Americans, that's not a question we can answer on our own. I don't care how long you're here. I could be here 50 years. I will always be an outsider. I will always be a cultural outsider. That's just how it goes. So we need the voices of Belizeans at the table with us to help us understand, to help narrate the reality that we live in, and to help us listen for how Christ is calling. And so that's why, and this was the first time we've done, as a community, that we've done apostolic discernment with lay partners. And so I think that's been a really tremendous gift for me, maybe for you guys as well. What's been my experience of this? Well, certainly, as I said, working with lay partners has been great. I've also been really encouraged by the Jesuits here, that Jesuits most people don't like planning processes. And if you say, gentlemen, we're going to do 9 months of planning, and then their eyes glaze over and they want to kill you, right? But for the most part, guys have been extremely engaged in this process. And I think we're asking really, really good questions that get guys, that bring guys into the process. That's been wonderful to see. In some ways, that's what I love about being a Jesuit, is that we get to wrestle with some of those big questions, right? About mission and identity. So, yeah, that's been
great.
And it's a process that we're coming towards the end of, and of course, it's something we're doing together. But you personally, from your experience, but also from the relationships you have with people here, knowing the community as you do, where do you see the Spirit moving here in Belize right now, in the church and in the country as a whole?
That's a good question. I'll say this about Belize, I do not find this very often in the United States, in my own home culture. I find people in Belize, by and large, to be extremely hungry for depth. I think there is a hunger for communion with God, there's a desire for contemplation, even if people don't know what that word is or they don't even know how to apply that. I think people want to encounter God in deep ways. So a lot of Belizeans pray. Their prayer life, their spirituality is very devotional, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. With saying rosaries and your devotions to the saints and your chaplets and that's great. Hey, that's perfect. That's wonderful. But I think that there are a lot of Belizeans who realize that, hey, you know what? Praying is a lot more than just saying the words, isn't it? Just reciting prayers. That people are hungry for something deeper, and that gets me excited. And not just for a sense, I think that there are Belizeans who are not just hungry for a sense of God, in the sense of, okay, now I'm with God, all done, but also a sense of mission. I think that there are a lot of Belizeans who have this relationship with God, and they're looking for ways to serve God by serving God's people. And I think Jesuit spirituality and the Jesuit charism is a wonderful fit for many, many people here. Maybe not everybody, but I think for many people, because ours is a spirituality that's not just in a church or off in a cave somewhere, but ours is a spirituality that is always pushing us out of the chapel, always pushing us out of the church, onto the streets, and into the people, the lives of people who live on the margins. And I think that there are people here in Belize who are hungry for that. So that's where the Spirit, I think, is inviting us to somehow meet that need. So I think lay formation is going to be crucial for us moving forward. And that's the same thing that we heard in all the feedback from the Synod as well. People are hungry for formation, right? Not just information, but formation leading to transformation of themselves, of their own lives, but also of our nation.
You may be answering this question already, but I want to ask it more explicitly, and this is our final question before the final question. And but what is your hope for the Jesuit community in the coming years in Belize? Just if you were to imagine next 10 years, what's your hope for us?
My hope for that's it. Well, I told you not to ask hard questions. I think my hope for the Jesuit community is that we can stay in this space, a couple things. One, that we can stay in this space of freedom that we seem to be in now as we go through this apostolic planning process. That we can keep asking questions about, okay, how is God calling us now? And that next year we can come back and say, okay, how is God calling us now? Right? That we become men of discernment rather than men who discern every now and again. Every 20 years we'll sit down to do planning. No, that discernment becomes a part of our lives. And as much as Jesuits talk about discernment, I don't know that we do it at the communal level. We don't do it particularly well. I think that our community has been exceptional this year in that regard. So that's the first thing. Second thing, it's been very clear from our discernment thus far that there is a strong pull among our men to be with people who are crucified, right? And this term came up, the crucified peoples of Belize. So yes, we are called to love everybody. Yes, absolutely. And then there are children who get raped, and women who get beaten bloody by their spouses, and men who feel so much despair that they drink themselves silly, and young men who only feel a sense of self when they have a gun in their hands, and maybe young women who only feel a sense of self when there's a baby in their belly. This is the world we live in. We all carry our crosses, but then you got people who are crucified. My hope for the Jesuit community is that we are here, first and foremost, for them and with them, to walk with the people who have been beaten down by life, to walk with the traumatized, because that, as Jesuits, is where we find our identity, at the foot of the cross, right?
Powerful, powerful. I love it.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to point out that you kind of rephrased it, but our question that we begin our episodes with, what is God calling me to today? I mean, you kind of rephrased that. And I, all jokes aside, I think you really have captured what Magis means in how you're describing our efforts as the Society of Jesus and our lay partners here in Belize, that we're not content to do what we know we're good at, or what we think we're good at, or what we've always done, but we're willing to ask those questions in order to look at the reality as it is now. Mm-hmm. and to let that reality inform us as we move forward.
If we're doing it right, I think that's what we're doing. Unfortunately, we're all learning how to do this.
Yeah.
We're all learning how to do this.
Well, as Ian mentioned, we always end our episode with a final question. And this episode's final question is very much geared towards you. You're a fan of musicals, is that right?
Oh, if we ever lock down again, watch out, because then we're putting on Hamilton, the Jesuits. No.
And maybe that's your answer to this question. The question is, what would be your favorite musical?
Okay, I'm going to answer your question with a question. I want to see, can you identify? I'm going to sing the musical for you.
Wow.
And I want you to
Please
see if
do.
you can identify.
All right.
We're going to see how good you are at this.
Everyone listen up.
Okay.
Maria, I once met a girl named Maria, and suddenly that name will never be the same to me. Gentlemen?
I have no idea. You might need to sing more.
I think I know it. I think I know it. West Side Story, no?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Exactly. The 1961 version, not this new stuff.
Okay, so that would be your favorite.
I think that's my favorite, yeah.
Wow. Do you want to say a little bit of why? Why it's your favorite?
I want to be in America. Okay, by me in America.
It's just catchy. It's catchy, yeah.
It's extremely catchy. It's extremely catchy, and when I was in college, my roommate and I, one night, I'm not going to give any other details about circumstances, we decided to rewrite the lyrics. Anyway, I'm just going to stop right there. I'm going to stop right there.
Great.
And yes, it's a fun musical. Beautiful music. Yep.
All right.
Anyway.
I'll answer. I won't sing. I'm not a big fan of musicals. I'm uncultured. I mean, I grew up in small.
You think
town
it's macho?
Texas.
You think it's macho?
It's not macho. No, it's not macho. Like, I mean, I guess being like if you think Broadway's or like
small town
the
Texas,
pinnacle
you
of
didn't
culture,
put on
there's a little bit of elitism there, but I support musicals though. When I watched Hamilton, I understood. So it has to be Hamilton because it's one of the few musicals that I've watched.
Okay, all right.
It actually might be the only musical I've watched, but I only saw it, the on Disney Plus.
Well, you grew up playing football. That was your thing.
Yeah. I'm uncultured though, but Hamilton it was revolution. It was a revelation.
Well, listen, if we lock down again as a community, we're going to put on Hamilton. So that's going to be your chance.
Well, Dan has been singing Alexander Hamilton.
I have.
Yeah, and so he's got the Hamilton part for sure.
Would you say is that your favorite?
Yeah, what's your favorite, Dan?
Actually, no. I would not say Hamilton is my favorite. I love Hamilton. I think it's the best that I've seen, but it's not my favorite.
What's your favorite?
My favorite musical is Music Man.
I knew you were going to say that. 76 trombones, something.
I don't even know, but I think I've seen it live, performed 5 or 6 times.
Okay, all right.
And not because I'm going around touring places trying to find it, but it's just happened.
It's okay, you can own that.
And I like it, I think, because I identify a little bit with Harold Hill. I can't read music. I play guitar.
You're a shyster? You scam people?
I kind of and I've had moments professionally where I've been asked to direct a choir, and I can't read music. So I'm up there literally doing this, and I'm Harold Hill.
Well, that's Sal. How about you? You got a favorite musical? He's saying no. He's saying no. That's
He's
okay.
behind the camera.
We'll work on that, Sal.
Well, Brian, we want to thank you for being on the show with us. You can come back. This was fun. Yeah,
it's great.
We've never had anyone sing on the show before, so the fans might call for an encore. So we'll bring
I'm
you
here.
back on.
I'm here.
All right. Well, if you have a favorite musical that you'd like to hear Father Brian sing, then let us know on Facebook or YouTube. And if you're listening to this on Guadalupe Media's television channel or on the radio, thank you for being with us. And we look forward to being with you again next time with more Jesuits and hopefully Father Brian in the future. So everyone have a good day.